All right, hello and welcome everybody to the first episode of the Big Three on CPA TV of the new year. As always, my name is Mihir and I'm joined by my co-host and fellow economist, Andrew Reschenberg, and today we're going to be talking to you about the big three topics happening in trade that are on our mind. But before we get to the show, we wanted to give you all a preview of the topics that we have in mind for you today. So it's only been a couple weeks to the new year, but we've been pretty busy at CPA, and Andrew and I have been publishing a couple of articles that we wanted to talk to you about. So the first was concerning an issue that is on our mind about biotech licensing agreements that the U.S. big pharma companies have been signing with Chinese biotech companies, and some of the concerns we have about how some of the early stage innovation is essentially being placed in the hands of our biggest geopolitical adversaries. So that's something that we're going to be talking about. The second issue on our minds is the fact that 2025 trade data is out, and it confirms something kind of alarming, something that should be alarming to Washington policymakers, is the fact that China's trade surplus has exceeded $1 trillion. So we have some research talking about what the implications are for global trade and some of the concerns we have about that development. And I'm going to kick it over to Andrew for the third item on our minds for this week.
For the third topic this week, we have Chinese investments in the U.S. China has been investing in strategic U.S. businesses, everything from solar to batteries, copper, aluminum, aerospace, data, you name it. We have tons of Chinese investment coming into these critical industries. And these have included both acquisitions of U.S. companies and new facilities that they're building here in the U.S. And a lot of these facilities, believe it or not, are actually getting funded by U.S. taxpayers through the IRA for solar or battery facilities, and they're being sold as these U.S. companies, but really it's a lot of funding going to these Chinese companies that are really only benefiting China. And they're using these investment options to actually still maintain functional control of the U.S. supply chain. We've put in place Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs to try to get an independent supply chain, especially for these critical industries here in the U.S., but China has found this back door in able to maintain control of these U.S. investments in companies throughout many, many different sectors. And Congress has tried to recently restrict this through equity thresholds for these Chinese companies, but it really hasn't been enough. China's been strategically lowering their equity thresholds while maintaining control with IP, supply chain, management, a lot of other subversive tactics. And so we'll get into that today, and let's get started.
All right, so for the first topic of the day, we thought it'd be good to talk about some of the implications behind some of the record licensing agreements that some of the multinational, large big pharma, as we call them, in the United States, companies have been making with Chinese biotech firms, especially in the early stage innovation cycle of the next big biotech drugs or biopharma drugs that are in the pipeline. So to be specific, U.S. drug companies have made $53 billion in licensing deals with Chinese biopharma firms since 2020. And that's essentially redirecting investments that should be made in, say, like the research hubs that we have in the United States, like in California, et cetera. And we're essentially giving that over to the CCP. Now, obviously, some of the advantages that China offers are similar to a lot of the so-called advantages that they offer in a lot of other industries, which lower cost production. A lot of early stage clinical trials are happening a lot quicker in China. Lots has to do, of course, with the way they have prioritized that sector. And it's really, there's really concerns given, Andrew, obviously you've been really heavily involved in the pharma research at CPA, and I know you've talked a lot about the implications of whether it's our growing dependence on China for active pharmaceutical and ingredients and things like that. Why don't you talk a little bit about maybe some of the concerns that you've seen, particularly in this whole biopharma space, based on some of your research?
Yeah, so the big trend that we see here with China, and this happens with a lot of different industries, not just for pharmaceuticals or biotech, but China's strategy, which makes a lot of sense, is that they first take control of the manufacturing portion. They're a huge manufacturing hub for many different ingredients. As you can see, everything's made in China now, and they've done this with pharma. You look at APIs, which are the base pharmaceutical active ingredients that you need to make any drugs in the world. And China has really learned to dominate this space. And they start moving up this chain with being able to manufacture drugs, manufacture the APIs, the critical ingredients, and they use this manufacturing presence to really then move up the chain into this research biotech space. And it's a really easy rule that wherever you make something is also where the innovation takes place. You're experimenting, you're learning how to make things better and faster, and your research really accelerates with that. And that's what we've seen with China and biotech, that they've first taken control of this manufacturing space, and now they're moving up the chain to doing research, to doing biotechnology, to really working with a lot of US companies to do testing and development in China. And we're losing a lot of ground on these studies and this development to China because we first gave away our manufacturing space. But it also doesn't come with the benefits as you might expect. There's been a lot of really rushed studies. They're really cutting a lot of corners, and the results really can't be trusted as well. They're primarily all tested on ethnic Han Chinese, which is a very homogenous population group in China. And the results for that just aren't accurate for a country as diverse as America, where you have a lot of different ethnic groups, a lot of different nationalities here in America. And what might work medically for the Han Chinese doesn't necessarily work for everyone. And so while they're moving really fast in this space, it's really a dangerous game. And so we have to be really cautious that we're really getting to be over-reliant on these Chinese studies and this Chinese research, while our own research is being hollowed out. And so I think this is a very dangerous space, but a lot of US companies are helping them along in this track. And so that's another thing we need to look into with all the joint ventures that you need to set up whenever you go into China. And you basically have to share your technology with them in order to operate in China, in order to run these businesses, to manufacture there or to do research there, and because it's cheaper. But you also have to give away some of our US technology. So we're giving away our advantage. And this has happened with biotech. This has happened with Chinese large civil aircraft with Comac, which wouldn't be where it is today without Airbus and Boeing sharing their technology. And it's a dangerous trend that we're seeing across a lot of different industries.
And at the same time, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. We're cutting NIH funding. We are the innovation center of the world when it came to biotech, and we're kind of undermining our own advantages in doing things like that. I think I even saw something like Chinese biotech companies supply something like 1/3 of the new compounds entering the U.S. drug pipelines. And the other thing we always have to be mindful of is the military civil fusion that China operates under, where they kind of enmesh their civilian, applications, whether it's drugs or whether it's, just goods, consumer goods and things like that. They enmesh products that are ostensibly for civilian purposes with their military apparatus. So you just don't know what exactly you're contributing to if you're a U.S. pharmaceutical company giving money over to the Chinese in that realm. So it's definitely a real concern. So that's one research agenda, like one research item that we published last week. Another kind of forthcoming analysis that we have is, in 2025, the trade data has kind of finally come through. And it looks like China has exceeded a threshold of something like $1.2 trillion in trade surplus. So essentially, that's the delta between how much they are exporting relative to their imports. And this is the largest trade surplus that any country has ever recorded in recorded history. So this has significant impacts down the road. And I think the analysis we've got going is to really talk about why Washington needs to act fast, because the fact is this is the greatest distortionary force, I think, happening in global trade right now. There's a lot of hand-wringing and concern about how U.S. tariffs are going to destroy global trade, and there's not really much focus, or as much focus, I think, on just how impactful China's mercantilist trade policies are. And I think that analysis is really going to focus on, the one issue that's not being talked about as much is how devalued China's currency has been, and how that has essentially acted as a hidden subsidy for Chinese producers because it's made their products cheaper to sell, to foreigners. And because there's such limited consumption in their country, they are essentially just exporting everything to the rest of the world, and that's their growth model. It's just not sustainable. So maybe if you had some thoughts, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, you really can't underestimate how reliant China's economy is on this huge export surplus that they've been running for years and years. That's how modern China was built, is on this trade model. And so whenever countries like the US start putting in trade restrictions on China in order to prop up our own industries, to make sure we have our own independent supply base, China doesn't just change their model overnight, they adjust. And that's exactly what we've been seeing over the past few years, ever since 2018 when Trump started with the Section 301 tariffs. We've seen China still maintaining and even growing their trade surpluses, but redirecting them to other countries. And so one of the big recipients has been Southeast Asia, where if you look at the trade data over the years, China's trade surplus to Southeast Asia has increased in just about the same portion as their trade surplus with the US has decreased. And so what they've really been doing is they've been changing their model in order to go through third countries to still reach markets like the US, whether that's actually done with substantial transformation or if there's some transshipment involved in there. That gets into really murky ground. It's probably an answer of a little bit in between, a little bit of both. But what they've been doing is they've been maintaining this export model, but just shifting it to other countries, to countries like Southeast Asia. They've increased their exports to Europe quite a bit, which has been a lot slower on protecting their own market, which might be changing in the next few years with some of the announcements. But at the moment, they're still a lot more vulnerable. And so I think the key indication is that China's not changing their model. They still are very reliant on these exports, and they're doing everything possible to maintain them. And another big element of this is currency manipulation. China's been consistently lowering the value of their own currency to make their exports cheaper. And this, in turn, really diminishes the effects of a lot of the US tariffs that are put in place. If China's lowering the values of these goods, then they have to pay less and less of that actual tariff because their currency is worth less and less. And so it's making their goods cheaper and allowing them to maintain these huge surpluses.
Yeah, I think that's definitely going to be a real concern because as we start, I think there's 3 or 4 negotiation rounds. I read something about how the U.S. is going to be meeting with China, 4 times over the next year. And one thing you're not hearing as much about is, again, currency. We need to put that on the table and kind of. I feel like we need to almost have our tariffs need to be assessed based off of any kind of devaluation or any kind of currency depreciation, any currency issue that needs to be, I think, involved in that conversation because as we've talked about, I mean, that is a subsidy that's not being talked about. We know how extensive their industrial policies are. They're estimated at roughly 4% of their GDP, several times higher than any of the next, related Western OECD developed countries. So it's not only a sizable commitment that they're making in industrial policy, whether it's subsidies, cheap, state-backed credit and things like that. Those are the things that we often talk about. But again, the currency adds another level of subsidy to these producers that's juicing their exports and again, destroying global trade or kind of dismantling manufacturing. Really, especially in the United States, of course, that's our concern. But yeah, it's really a concern that we need to really focus on in the next year. And I think I want to kick it over to you, actually, to talk a little bit about the piece that was just released on Chinese investment, because you've talked about how, China doesn't really change their model. They've got their patterns in place of how they can operate undetected and kind of circumvent the rules. So why don't you talk a little bit about how they're doing that in the investment realm?
So while China has been really increasing their trade exports to countries like in Southeast Asia or with Europe, the US, of course, remains the biggest market in the entire world for these export goods. They still are very reliant on the US market. And since the US has put a lot of new tariffs in place, whether it's through Section 232 or 301 or the new IEEPA tariffs, this is becoming harder and harder for China to just export directly to the US. But that doesn't mean that they're giving up on our market at all. If anything, they're trying to double down and maintain control and maintain these supply links, but they're doing it through a lot of other methods. And one of the primary methods that they've been doing this with is direct investments in the US. They've been investing in a lot of critical US industries, a lot of the industries that we've actually launched Section 232 investigations in, such as aluminum or solar. They've been involved in the battery space, aerospace, data centers, steel, you name it. They're involved in a lot of these different industries here in the US, including with acquisitions, taking over U.S. companies, buying them outright, and building new facilities of their own right here in the U.S. or in Mexico or Canada, which has a lot easier access to the U.S. market. And a lot of these facilities are even getting taxpayer funded. So they're picking some of these particular industries, such as solar or batteries, which are getting a lot of U.S. tax credits through the IRA, and they are actually getting U.S. taxpayer fundings to set up Chinese companies here in the U.S. And no other country in the world subsidizes something like this. If you're a U.S. company and you want to go to Europe or China or any country in the world, those governments aren't going to pay you to have a U.S. company be set up there. And so it's ridiculous that we've been allowing something like this, but China's really been taking advantage of it. And recently, in the past year, Congress has tried to restrict some of these Chinese activities, particularly for the ones that are getting taxpayer funds, but it hasn't been enough because, again, China is continuing to adjust to the rules of the game and trying to get around and manipulate their exact standing in order to get around them. So one of the thresholds is you have to have below 25% ownership threshold for these Chinese companies of concern. And what they've done is they've lowered it just below the threshold, just in time to continue qualifying for these tax funds, while maintaining and even deepening a lot of their connections through supply chain directly from China or from Chinese-owned companies. There's a lot of times direct Chinese managerial oversight of these companies, Chinese IP being used, and a lot of times facilities in China or Chinese-owned facilities in Southeast Asia, for example, are directly supplying and propping up these U.S. facilities, and which are really just in there to get the taxpayer funds or provide this channel, this back way that China can continue bringing these goods into the U.S. And the reason this is so important is because these are all industries that the U.S. has determined with Section 232 investigations that we need to have our own supply of. We need to have an independent supply, a U.S. supply for steel, for aluminum, for all these critical industries. And if we're still reliant on China at the end of the day, whether those facilities are located in the U.S., Mexico, China, doesn't matter. We're still reliant and we still don't have our own independent supply. It's like we've been building up a fence in the front yard to protect against these Chinese investments, but we've left the back door wide open for them to come in and set up shop in our own living room.
Yeah, it really is a game of whack-a-mole. You know, in the good side, folks are starting to come around to the whole way that the transshipment has worked, where we've imposed tariffs on China and they've simply just rerouted it through, Southeast Asia and Mexico and other places with more favorable tariff, relationship with the United States. And something similar, yeah, it's almost interesting to see how that's happening in the investment world. I think one of the more concerning takeaways, I think, from our analysis was almost like a lot of state-backed capital from China is coming into the United States. So when we think of how China is lending, their lending practices, we think of their Belt and Road Initiative, where they're trying to build up infrastructure in developing countries or the global South, so to speak. But when you actually look at the numbers, the U.S. has been by far the largest recipient of state-backed aid from China, which is it's just eye-popping to see, and we got the numbers to show it in the report. But especially, this has really kickstarted since 2018 when those tariffs were first imposed. So to your point, I mean, again, they've really found a way around all of the rules that we seem to impose, and we always seem to be a step behind. So I think it's so important that the kind of research that we're doing alerts policymakers to this concern, so they can develop some more agility, frankly, when it comes to, not only responding to these issues, but to really be prospective and to see, okay, well, we've seen this playbook happen so many times. How do we get out ahead of this issue for once, rather than just simply like, okay, China's going to do this and we're going to, retroactively kind of try to punish them. It's just, it's a real challenge here for policymakers. They really got to get it together. So unless you had any concluding thoughts, I think we can stop here for our first episode of the new year. Hope you all enjoyed the show. We look forward to talking to you all next week when we reveal the next big 3 items that are on our mind for the week. So on behalf of Andrew and the folks at CPA, I want to say take care, have a good week, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.